What if I told you Nero didn't actually fiddle while Rome burned? The truth about Rome's most infamous emperor is far more disturbing than the myth. From poisoning his stepbrother to executing his own mother, Nero's reign was a masterclass in unchecked power. Tonight, we'll unravel the real man behind the legends. He was born into a family where power struggles were more common than family dinners. His mother Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, which meant she had ambition in her blood. She wasn't the type to sit back and let history happen. She made it. When Nero was just 3 years old, his father died under suspicious circumstances. Agrippina quickly remarried her uncle, Emperor Claudius, just to get her son closer to the throne. At 16, Nero became emperor, the youngest in Rome's history, up to that point. His tutor Seneca tried to teach him about philosophy, justice, and how to rule wisely. For a while, it almost worked. Early coins minted during his reign show Nero with a youthful, almost innocent face, like he could have been a decent leader. But power has a way of revealing people's true nature. Nero's stepbrother, Britannicus, was next in line for the throne. He was only 13, but that didn't stop Nero. During a family dinner, Britannicus took a sip of wine and suddenly collapsed. The official story was that he had a seizure, but Roman writers like Tacitus say it was poison. Nero watched the whole thing without reacting. When Britannicus started convulsing, Nero just kept eating. He later claimed it was divine justice because the gods wouldn't let someone unworthy live. The Senate, which should have been horrified, stayed quiet. They'd seen what happened to people who disagreed with Nero. His mother, Agrippina, was furious because Britannicus was her last bargaining chip. Without him, she couldn't control Nero anymore. That was the moment Nero learned he could get away with murder. Literally. But the real problem wasn't just that Nero killed his stepbrother. It was how little it seemed to bother him. There was no guilt, no dramatic breakdown, just a detached curiosity, like he was watching an experiment. He didn't even see Britannicus as a person, just an obstacle. And once obstacles were gone, Nero thought nothing could stop him. The public barely reacted, partly because they were afraid, but also because Roman politics was brutal, even before Nero. If you were powerful enough, you could get away with almost anything. But Nero didn't stop at one crime. He treated power like a game, where the rules didn't apply to him, which meant the worst was yet to come. His mother, Agrippina, was still alive, and she still thought she could pull his strings. But Nero was done letting anyone tell him what to do. She had schemed for years to put her son in power, not realizing she was raising a monster she couldn't control. It wouldn't end well for either of them. The poisoning of Britannicus wasn't just about removing a rival. It was Nero's way of declaring that he wouldn't share power with anyone. Not family, not advisors, no one. And once he started eliminating threats, he didn't stop. The real question wasn't whether Nero would kill again, but who would be next. For now, though, the stage was set. The young emperor had shown his teeth. The Senate stayed silent. The public watched nervously, and Nero realized no one was going to stop him. That kind of power does something to a person's mind, especially a teenager who already thought he was a god. With Britannicus dead, Nero had no real rivals left in the palace. His mother was still around, but she was losing influence fast. The tutors, the advisors, none of them could contain him anymore. This wasn't a boy being guided by wise men. This was someone who now believed he was untouchable. That kind of thinking never ends well. Even in Rome, where emperors did whatever they wanted, there were limits. But Nero didn't see them. he thought the rules were for other people, which is why his next moves were so much worse. If poisoning a child was shocking, what came next would make Rome question everything. For now, though, Nero had won. He was the emperor, with no one left to challenge him. The Senate pretended everything was fine. The poets wrote flattering verses, and the people distracted themselves with bread and circuses. But deep down, they all knew. This wasn't normal, and it was only the beginning. The final straw came when he began charging admission for his shows. Romans were used to free entertainment. Now they had to pay to listen to their emperor sing off-key. The crowds dwindled, so Nero solved the problem by making attendance mandatory for certain classes. It's hard to say what was more insulting, the bad performances or the fact that Nero expected everyone to act like they enjoyed them. Either way, his artistic phase wasn't just embarrassing, it was undermining the entire empire. The military especially hated it. Roman soldiers respected strength and discipline, not emperors who pranced around in Greek costumes. When Nero performed in a lyre competition wearing a silk robe, commanders back in Germania face-palmed. This was the man supposed to lead them in battle? Looking back, the Neronia was a mistake from the start. Nero could have been a patron of the arts without humiliating himself and Rome. But subtlety wasn't his style. He didn't want to just support artists. He wanted to be the greatest artist of all time. This delusion cost him what little respect he had left. The Senate tolerated his murders. They ignored his scandals. But forcing Rome's elite to sit through bad poetry readings? That was crossing a line. By 64 AD, whispers of rebellion were growing. The Praetorian Guard, usually loyal, started cracking jokes about their singing emperor. Provincial governors stopped sending flattering letters about his performances. Even the common people mocked him openly. Nero responded by performing even more. He took it as proof that they just didn't understand his genius. In his mind, the problem wasn't his talent. It was that Rome wasn't cultured enough to appreciate him. The irony? Nero wasn't completely untalented. Some accounts suggest he had decent musical ability, but surrounded by yes-men who praised everything he did, he never improved. Instead of taking criticism, he killed the critics. That's no way to grow as an artist or a ruler. In the end, his artistic ambitions helped seal his downfall. The more he performed, the more people realized how unfit he was to rule. The murders had been bad, but at least those were traditionally imperial. A singing emperor playing dress-up? That was something Rome couldn't stomach. What Nero never understood was that being emperor wasn't a role you could perform. It was a job you had to do. While he was busy chasing applause, the empire was falling apart around him. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 AD, Nero was in Antium. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying much of the city. And that's when everything changed. Because whether he fiddled or not, one thing was certain. Rome needed someone to blame. Nero had spent years making enemies with his performances. Now those enemies saw their chance. The fire became the excuse everyone needed to turn against him. In a way, his artistic ambitions had prepared the ground for his downfall. By alienating the Senate, the military, and the people, he'd left himself vulnerable. All it took was one crisis for everything to unravel. The tragedy? Nero genuinely believed in his artistic gifts. He thought he'd be remembered as a great performer, not a tyrant. When his reign finally collapsed, his last words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me." The punchline? Nobody disagreed. They were just glad he was gone. In July of 64 AD, Rome caught fire. Not a small kitchen fire, not a contained blaze. This was a 6-day inferno that ate through the city's winding alleys and wooden tenements with terrifying speed. It started near the Circus Maximus, whether by accident or design, and spread through 10 of Rome's 14 districts. By the time it was over, thousands were homeless, and much of the city lay in ashes. Nero wasn't even in Rome when it started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. When he got word, he returned immediately. Tacitus says he organized firefighting efforts, opened his gardens to refugees, and lowered grain prices to prevent starvation. That's the official record. But another story spread just as fast, that Nero watched the flames from a safe distance while singing about the fall of Troy. Not just watching, performing. The fiddle part is made up. It wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. But the image stuck because it fit perfectly with what people already thought of Nero. Who else would treat a disaster like a private concert? Whether he actually sang isn't the point. The fact that anyone believed it tells you everything. Rome had no professional fire department. Citizens formed bucket brigades while slaves and soldiers tried to create fire breaks by tearing down buildings. Nero allegedly sent his own men to help, but rumors said they weren't there to stop the fire. They were making it worse. Some claimed they were seen spreading flames with torches. Whether that's true or not, plenty of Romans thought Nero wanted the city to burn. Here's why the theory gained traction. After the fire, Nero seized a huge chunk of the ruined land for his Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This wasn't just a palace, it was a 300-acre monument to himself, complete with artificial lakes and a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero as the sun god. The optics were terrible. People who'd lost everything saw their emperor building a pleasure palace on the ashes of their homes. The fire changed everything. Before, Nero was just a weird, self-absorbed ruler. Now he was a potential arsonist. The public needed someone to blame, and he was the obvious candidate. Even his relief efforts backfired. When he opened his gardens to refugees, people whispered. It was just to keep them from revolting. Lowering grain prices? A cheap bribe. Every move looked calculated because at this point, no one trusted him. Ancient historians can't agree on what actually happened. Tacitus admits the truth is unclear, but notes that many believed Nero set the fire to clear land for his building projects. Suetonius goes further, saying Nero watched the flames from a tower while dressed in stage costume, singing about the destruction of Troy. Modern historians doubt this. Fires were common in Rome, and spontaneous combustion in the packed slums around the Circus Maximus wouldn't need imperial help. But Nero's reputation made the story plausible. There's also the question of motive. If Nero wanted to rebuild Rome, why not just wait? The city burned regularly. Within living memory, entire neighborhoods had gone up in flames. Why risk such an obvious backlash? Then again, this was the same man who'd poisoned his stepbrother and tried to drown his mother with a collapsible boat. Rational thinking wasn't his strong suit. What we know for sure, the fire created an opportunity Nero couldn't resist. 3 days after it ended, he unveiled plans for his golden house. The scale was unprecedented. He wanted a palace complex that would cover parts of 4 different hills. Romans had never seen anything like it. Previous emperors had built public works, temples, baths, roads. Nero built a private playground where the plebs used to live. To make matters worse, he didn't even try to hide his excitement. While survivors scavenged in the ruins, Nero hosted lavish parties in the untouched parts of his existing palace. Guests reported that he recited poems about the burning of Troy during these dinners, which didn't help his case. Whether he meant it as a tribute or just bad taste, it looked like he was celebrating. The real problem wasn't whether Nero started the fire. It was that no one could prove he didn't. His past behavior made him the perfect suspect. When you've already killed family members and tortured political enemies, people will believe anything. Even if he'd spent those 6 days personally carrying buckets of water, the rumors would still have spread. So, Nero did what any paranoid dictator would do. He found scapegoats. The Christians were a perfect target, a small, unpopular sect that refused to worship Roman gods. They were already viewed with suspicion. Nero accused them of arson, and the public, desperate for someone to punish, agreed. The persecutions were brutal. Tacitus describes Christians being covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified or set on fire to illuminate Nero's garden parties. It backfired. Instead of shifting blame, the executions just made Nero look more unhinged. Even Romans who disliked Christians thought this was excessive. Meanwhile, construction on the Domus Aurea continued. The project sucked up money and manpower while homeless citizens camped in ruins. Nero's advisors warned him about the backlash, but he wouldn't listen. He'd convinced himself Rome needed this, needed him to rebuild better than before. In his mind, the fire was an opportunity, not a tragedy. The Senate watched all this in silent horror. Many had tolerated Nero's excesses, but burning Rome? That crossed a line. Even if he hadn't ordered it, his response was a disaster. Instead of unifying the city, he'd divided it further. The rich resented his land grabs. The poor resented his indifference. The military resented the wasted resources. By the time the Domus Aurea was half finished, Nero had run out of allies. The fire hadn't just destroyed buildings. It had burned away the last shreds of his legitimacy. His only remaining supporters were the sycophants who clapped at his performances, and even they were getting nervous. The fiddle myth tells us more about Nero's legacy than the real events ever could. It doesn't matter if he played an instrument while Rome burned. What matters is that it's the first thing people think of when they hear his name. He became the punchline of his own reign, a man who thought he was an artist but would be remembered as a monster. That's the thing about fires. They destroy, but they also reveal. The heat stripped away Nero's remaining mask. After this, no one could pretend he was a normal ruler. He wasn't a statesman or a general or even a competent administrator. He was just a guy who got lucky, then burned through all his goodwill. Rome rebuilt, as it always did. The Domus Aurea didn't last. Nero's successors tore most of it down in disgust. But the damage to his reputation was permanent. From that point on, everything he did was seen through the smoke of that fire. Whether he set it or not became irrelevant. History had already decided. When the first flames broke out near the Circus Maximus, no one could have predicted how completely they would consume Nero's reign. But looking back, it makes perfect sense. A man who spent his life playing with fire was bound to get burned. While Rome's citizens were still digging through the ashes of their homes, Nero started construction on a palace so massive it would cover an area larger than Monaco. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, wasn't just another imperial residence. It was a 300-acre middle finger to every Roman who had lost everything in the fire. The project began immediately after the flames died down, before most people could even rebuild their shacks. At its heart stood a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero, styled as the sun god. The Colossus Neronis wasn't subtle. You could see it from nearly anywhere in Rome. Workers gilded it so thoroughly that on sunny days it literally blinded people looking at it. The message was clear. Nero wasn't just an emperor, he wanted to be worshipped. The The palace itself sprawled across 4 of Rome's hills, connected by covered walkways lined with precious stones. Nero's engineers designed dining rooms with rotating ivory ceilings that mimicked the night sky, complete with hidden mechanisms to sprinkle flower petals and perfumed oil on guests. Some ceilings had pipes that sprayed perfume while hidden musicians played. The floors were inlaid with mother of pearl, so they shimmered like water when people walked across them. A mile-long colonnade bordered the main courtyard, but this wasn't just some decorative walkway. Nero stocked it with wild animals captured from across the empire. Lions, bears, even a few elephants that roamed freely between the columns. Guests had to be escorted by armed guards just to reach the dining rooms. The animals weren't just for show, they were part of the entertainment. Nero would sometimes release them during parties so guests could watch slaves fight for their lives. The palace grounds included an artificial lake where the Colosseum stands today, surrounded by vineyards and forests populated with exotic game. Workers transplanted full-grown trees so Nero could have instant forests. The baths used seawater and sulfur water piped in from miles away. One room was entirely lined with polished white marble, so smooth that Nero supposedly warned visitors not to lean on the walls. They'd slide right to the floor. Servants performed constant maintenance to keep the illusion of perfection. Teams of slaves followed guests around, wiping up their footprints from the marble floors. Others hid behind curtains to adjust the lighting and temperature as people moved between rooms. The whole operation required thousands of staff just to keep it functioning. Nero didn't just build over empty land. He seized property from temples and tore down public buildings to make space. When land ran short, his engineers built out over the streets, creating raised walkways so Nero wouldn't have to see commoners below. The phrase, "Quiritz, your houses are so small," became infamous. Whether Nero actually said it or not, people believed he would. The cost was astronomical. The project drained the imperial treasury to the point that Nero had to debase Rome's currency, reducing the silver content in coins by 10%. He imposed new taxes across the empire to fund construction. Provinces already struggling with corruption and mismanagement now had to send even more money to Rome. Meanwhile, most citizens were living in temporary shelters. The population density in Rome meant average people lived in cramped insulae apartments that were basically fire traps, which is why so many burned so quickly. These buildings were thrown up hastily after the fire, often collapsing under their own shoddy construction. Yet there stood the Domus Aurea, its gold leaf ceilings glittering just a short walk from neighborhoods still smelling of smoke. Nero's architect Severus pioneered construction techniques just for the palace. They developed a new type of concrete that could be molded into curves and domes, creating spaces that felt more like natural caves than man-made rooms. The octagonal room in particular was an engineering marvel, a domed space with a central oculus that flooded light down through multiple stories. It was perhaps the first building in history where the architecture itself was an artistic statement rather than just functional. The party never stopped. Nero kept the palace filled with guests at all hours, serving delicacies like parrotfish livers and flamingo tongues. One famous anecdote describes a banquet where guests were given perfumed napkins that turned out to be made from precious cloth. Their napkins were actually gifts worth a year's salary. Another time, Nero spent 4 million sesterces just on roses for a single evening's entertainment. That's roughly $60 million in today's money. Not even the palace's decorations were safe from Nero's ego. Instead of traditional frescoes depicting gods or heroic scenes, most artwork showed Nero himself as a warrior, as a god, even as Apollo playing the lyre. Statues of previous emperors were melted down to reuse the bronze for Nero's likeness. Some historians believe this is why we have so few statues of earlier rulers like Caligula. Nero had them destroyed for materials. Security was obsessive. The palace walls were patrolled by Germanic mercenaries who couldn't speak Latin. Ney didn't want them conspiring with locals. Underground tunnels connected different sections so he could move around unseen. Some areas had hidden doors that only opened from the inside, allowing servants to appear and disappear like ghosts. The sheer scale was meant to impress, but it mostly just alienated people. Senators invited to dinners would get lost in the endless corridors. Visiting dignitaries complained it took half an hour just to walk from the entrance to the dining hall. Even Nero's supporters started grumbling about the impracticality. You couldn't hold proper government business in a place designed for parties. Everyone knew the Domus Aurea was sucking resources from more important projects. Rome needed new aqueducts, repaired roads, and rebuilt neighborhoods. Instead, they got revolving dining rooms and an emperor who spent more time planning parties than governance. The military was particularly furious. Their wages were being delayed to pay for marble and gold leaf. Construction quality suffered as the project stretched on. Parts of the palace were still unfinished when Nero died, with mosaic tiles hanging half-set in their mortar. Some rooms never got their promised gold leaf. Workers just painted the walls yellow and hoped no one would look too close. The rapid construction left parts structurally unsound. Underground sections began flooding almost immediately because the drains weren't properly installed. Nero didn't care. He'd stroll through unfinished wings talking about his future plans. A theatre here, a new bath complex there. The scale kept expanding in his mind, even as real construction lagged. Visitors realized with dread that he intended to keep building forever, turning all Rome into his personal playground. The Domus Aurea became such a symbol of excess that later emperors couldn't wait to tear it down. Vespasian drained the artificial lake to build the Colosseum. Trajan buried much of the structure under his bath complex. What survives today only gives a faint impression of the original's scale. You can still visit some underground sections, but they're just a skeleton of what once was. In the end, the palace's greatest legacy was the anger it inspired. Romans could tolerate a bad emperor. They couldn't tolerate one who turned a disaster into his personal shopping spree. The Domus Aurea wasn't just a home. It was proof that Nero saw Rome as his property, not his responsibility. Where others saw citizens, he saw an audience for his performance. Where others saw a city to govern, he saw a canvas for his ego. As the palace walls rose higher, Nero's grip on reality seemed to slip. He spent more time wandering the halls talking to his statues than meeting with advisors. He'd perform concerts in empty rooms just to hear the acoustics. The man who'd started his reign as a boy emperor was now an isolated figure padding through endless corridors, lost in his own grandeur. The really tragic part? Nero barely got to enjoy his creation. He moved into the Domus Aurea in 68 AD. Within months, he'd be dead, a suicide chased out of Rome by rebels. The palace that was supposed to be his eternal monument became his tombstone instead. Most of it was dismantled before the paint even dried. Later emperors made sure to build public spaces where Nero's vanity project once stood. The Colosseum, the baths of Trajan, the Temple of Venus and Rome, all were designed to give back to the people what Nero had stolen. The message was clear. Rome belonged to its citizens, not to one man's ego. But for a brief, gilded moment, Nero got his wish. The Domus Aurea stood as a monument to what happens when absolute power meets absolute vanity. Today, its remnants serve a different purpose, a warning about the emperors who build palaces while their cities burn. Nero's death should have been the end of his story. Instead, it was just the beginning. The man who spent his life performing managed to pull off his greatest trick, disappearing while making sure no one would forget him. Within months of his suicide, rumors started spreading that he hadn't really died. Some said he'd fled to Parthia. Others claimed he was hiding in Egypt. The craziest part? People believed it. Because Nero wasn't just an emperor. He was a legend in his own mind. And that kind of ego doesn't just vanish. The first imposter showed up less than a year after Nero's death. A slave from Asia Minor looked enough like him to convince some desperate people. He gathered a small following before Roman troops cut him down. Then another one popped up, this time with better theatrics. He played the lyre at public gatherings, leaning into Nero's artistic persona. The third imposter, 20 years later, almost started a war. The Parthians, Rome's biggest enemies, seriously considered backing his claim just to destabilize the empire. These weren't just random liars. They understood Nero's brand. People would rather believe in a monster they knew than face the chaos that came after him. Early Christians turned Nero into something worse than an emperor. They called him the Antichrist. After watching their friends get turned into human torches, this wasn't just metaphor. It was trauma. The Book of Revelation references Nero by code, calling him the Beast, whose number is 666. Some scholars think this is a gematria puzzle. Adding up the Hebrew letters in Nero Caesar gives you that number. Whether intentional or not, the association stuck. For centuries after, any tyrant got compared to Nero. Hitler? Modern Nero? Stalin? Nero reborn. The man became shorthand for evil itself. Jewish texts tell a completely different story. Some saw Nero as a potential messiah. Sounds insane until you remember Nero's troops destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jewish rebels interpreted this catastrophe as a sign of the coming Messiah, and somehow Nero got tangled up in that prophecy. One Talmudic story even claims Nero converted to Judaism. It's a wild twist. The same man Christians called the Antichrist became, in some Jewish traditions, a seeker of truth, historical whiplash at its finest. The Sibylline oracles, Rome's ancient prophecy books, fueled the fire. They predicted Nero would return from the east with an army to take back his throne. These weren't fringe beliefs. People consulted these texts for major decisions. When 3 different emperors in the 200s AD had to put down Nero imposters, they weren't just fighting rebels. They were battling a myth that refused to die. Meanwhile, the Domus Aurea was falling apart. Nero's Golden Palace became a ghost town. Locals called it the Cave because they'd forgotten who built it. Artists like Raphael would later break in through holes in the ceiling, marveling at the frescoes still visible in the buried ruins. But in Nero's time, those tunnels were hiding something else. Whispers. Workers reported hearing lyre music in empty corridors. People swore they saw shadows moving where no one could be. Rome didn't just fear Nero's return, they expected it. The Middle Ages kept the legend alive. Nero showed up in Dante's Inferno, tortured in hell for being a heretic. German plays portrayed him as the ultimate villain. Even when the Roman Empire was long gone, Europeans couldn't shake his image. He became the boogeyman parents warned their kids about. Behave, or Nero will get you. The irony? The real Nero would have loved the attention. Modern historians can't agree on why Nero still fascinates us. Some say he was mentally ill, maybe schizophrenia or narcissistic personality disorder. Others argue he was just spoiled rotten, A rich kid handed absolute power with no consequences. The truth is messier. Nero wasn't insane by ancient standards. Rome had plenty of cruel rulers. What made Nero special was his complete lack of shame. He didn't hide his atrocities. He performed them. Take the way he died. Most fallen emperors begged or fought. Nero rehearsed his suicide like a scene from a play. He complained about the lighting, critiqued his own dying words. Even as the cavalry closed in, he was still performing. That's not insanity. That's someone who never learned the difference between life and theatre. The Nero Redivivus legend tells us more about Rome than about the man himself. People didn't want to believe such a vivid personality could just end. It was easier to imagine him lurking in the shadows, waiting to return. 3 centuries after his death, Emperor Septimius Severus had to officially ban Nero impersonators. That's how long the myth lasted. Christians needed Nero as their Antichrist. Jews needed him as their failed Messiah. The empire needed him as a warning. No one cared about the real Nero anymore. He'd become whatever people feared or desired. In death, he finally got what he wanted: an eternal audience. Historians still argue about his impact. Some point to his building projects. The Domus Aurea pushed Roman engineering forward. Others note that his persecution of Christians backfired spectacularly, making their religion stronger. Even his bad poetry might have influenced later writers. But none of that matters as much as the legend. When you hear "fiddled while Rome burned," you don't think about tax reforms. You think about madness. That's why the Nero Redivivus myth worked. It wasn't about the man. It was about the idea. An emperor so out of touch he'd burn his own city for inspiration. A ruler who cared more about applause than governance. A tyrant who never grew up. As long as those archetypes exist, Nero will always have imitators. Today, we see Nero everywhere. In dictators who build golden palaces while their people starve. In celebrities who think fame excuses cruelty. In politicians who treat governance like reality TV. The specifics change, but the pattern repeats. Absolute power doesn't always corrupt absolutely, but hand it to someone who thinks they're the star of the show, and you get Nero every time. The real Nero died alone in a villa, bleeding out on a dirty mattress. The legend outlived him by centuries. Maybe that's the ultimate irony. The man who wanted to be remembered as an artist became history's greatest cautionary tale instead. So, when you hear about some modern leader's latest scandal, ask yourself, is this Nero Redux? Because history doesn't repeat, but it sure rhymes. And Nero's legend is the catchiest tune of all. Theories about his mental state still swirl. Ancient sources claim he had nightmares about his mother's ghost, that he'd sneak out at night to rob graves for fun, that he once kicked a pregnant wife to death during an argument. Those could be exaggerations, or they could be glimpses of someone truly unhinged. Without modern psychology, we'll never know for sure. One thing's certain: Nero became Rome's benchmark for tyranny. Every bad emperor after got compared to him. Caligula was cruel, but he didn't have Nero's flair. Commodus was vain, but he lacked Nero's artistic pretensions. It took a special kind of madness to make ruining an empire look this entertaining. Even his enemies couldn't erase him. The Senate ordered his statues torn down, his name chiseled off monuments. It didn't work. You can't delete someone who lives in the collective imagination. Nero became the villain in every story Rome told itself about power gone wrong. Maybe that's why the Redivivus myth lasted so long. People needed to believe Nero could come back, not because they wanted him, but because they needed the warning. a reminder that unchecked power plus unlimited narcissism equals disaster. The legend wasn't about Nero, it was about us. So next time you see a leader more interested in performance than results, remember Nero. The original Diva Emperor didn't just wreck Rome, he gave us the perfect blueprint for recognizing tyranny's encore. The man's been dead for 2,000 years, but his show's still running. Now let's talk about why that matters today. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about the patterns we keep repeating. And Nero's pattern? That one's worth remembering. So that's Nero. A warning about what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited self-indulgence. His story shows how governance becomes performance art when leaders care more about applause than responsibility. Think about it. He wasn't some cartoon villain from day one. He started as Rome's golden boy, full of potential. That's the scariest part. The worst rulers often begin as the most promising. Before you go, let me know in the comments which modern leaders remind you of Nero. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient dysfunction, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. History keeps repeating itself, so we might as well pay attention.